Maybe you like.
This is Senate Appropriations, Tuesday, February 4th. Still going through the Budget Adjustment Act for 2025. There we have Hardin Merrill. What's your title? Deputy Commissioner?
Deputy Commissioner of Finance and Management.
Great. Thanks for coming in.
And happy to be here, Mr. Chair. I am here to talk about carry forward and reversions. This is a topic my department had not really provided committee testimony on until last year. The House Appropriations Committee was very interested in what was, especially in fiscal 24 Budget Adjustment Act, a very large list and involving a very large magnitude of funds being reverted and then available for reappropriation in the BAA. And they had a lot of questions in our initial BAA presentation about how and why funds were being reverted. And I think there was a lot of misunderstanding, at least by the committee at the time initially, about the powers of the executive. And I think there was concern about whether funds were being, taken from one purpose and repurposed for another. So a lot of the, a lot of my presentation, at least initially, the House was explaining the basis in statute and in session law around the carrying forward of appropriations and around the process of reversion, and really underlining the fact that any funds that are reverted, in order for them to be reappropriated for a different purpose than the original appropriation, that requires legislative action. And that is why we package recommended reversions along with recommended appropriation adjustments in the Budget Adjustment Act. And I think it was instructive to the committee then, but they found when they asked for detail, in terms of, they were asking specifically the question, which had not really been asked or presented before. Okay, if you're reverting this much from a particular appropriation, well, how much is being carried forward and used for other purposes? And so I provided that detail to the House last year. And then this committee also, on the recommendation of the House, asked me to come in and present the same information. And I think we're following the same drill this year. And actually this year, the House, I believe it was the House, but there was language inserted into 2024 Act 87, which was the FY24 BAA, requiring a report in section 103C, which is the annual carry forward language section, and they added a sub C requiring a report to be provided with the Governor's Budget Adjustment Act recommendation. And that's the document that I believe you just had loaded onto your agenda. Does everyone have that document? Or
that report is all these reversions on here are the 24 reversions.
These are
just the 24.
These are the this is the report required by the 24 Budget Adjustment Act. And so perhaps it might be instructive for me to cover, some of the terminology and process. When we use the term reversion in law and in practice, what we are referring to is dollars left in an appropriation at the end of a fiscal year that is unspent. And at that point, it can have two paths. It is either reverted, which means it drops back to the bottom line of that fund, and then it can be reappropriated, or the appropriation, if at the end of the fiscal year it has remaining spending authority, it can be carried forward, which means that same appropriation and spending authority goes from, in this case, FY24 into FY25, and it can continue to be spent for the same purpose for which it was originally appropriated. So that's
the default, is it would just carry forward unless we revert it.
It's actually it's interesting, and I'll try not to get too into the weeds, but I would point out in statute In codified law, the default is that every appropriation reverts at the end of the fiscal year. And so picture everything turning into a pumpkin and disappearing. For at least as long as I am aware of, there has been annual session law language inserted in the BAA that provides for a number of specifically named funds, including the general fund and the ed fund and the T fund, clean water, ag water quality. There's half a dozen or so funds, and it provides that these appropriations from these specific named funds at the end of the fiscal year, they can be carried forward and spent, but it's at the discretion of the Secretary of Administration for executive branch appropriations. Now, there's also language that says anything to the judiciary, anything for the legislative, it's automatic. It's carried forward and can be spent. And so
that language is section 80 on page 59 of the language.
Yes, in the current Budget Adjustment Act for FY25.
It's basically the same language we had.
It's the same thing. So that'll apply to current FY25 appropriations when we, June 30th, 2025. This provides the ability for them to carry forward, which is obviously, incredibly important because so many, especially one-time appropriations, are funding programs that are usually over multiple years with these large appropriations. And so things would just grind to a halt if the, if the spending authority disappeared. And so I think in practice, at least as long as I'm aware of historically, there's been this annual session law language in the BAA that provides for carry forward, but otherwise it actually wouldn't. And I'll note on that topic, in special funds all disappear at the end of the fiscal year. And that's why it's important that special funds budgets become active to begin the next fiscal year's requirements, at the end of each fiscal year. And special fund one-time appropriations from special funds are somewhat unusual, but sometimes they exist and sometimes they aren't all spent in a fiscal year. And what happens in that case is a department needs to request from Department of Finance and Management that spending authority be reinstated by the process of excess receipts.
Right.
And so I don't want to get too far down in the weeds, but just to provide a grounding of statutory default, and then what we say about carry forward each year. And I expect that the reason to make expenditure of carry forward at the discretion of the Secretary of Administration, who makes the final approval after Department of Finance and Management reviews each appropriation and reviews with each department what their plan is for that expenditure, is that, it allows a double check on does it really need to be spent or not? And if not, then that provides funds in BAA, because there are always going to be more additional expenses that were unplanned for, and we can't always plan on the revenue upgrades that we've been so fortunate to have in recent years. So taking a look at everything left at the end of the fiscal year and reviewing, and we receive the way we manage the process is the departments actually, we mail out a memo explaining the process just before the close of the fiscal year, and then we tell them the date they'll be able to actually query and find out how much they have left in each appropriation. We don't have the dust settle until this year it was July 19th, and then we require them to come up with a carry forward plan, how they propose to spend the money or not, or whether they recommend it for reversion. And then we review those plans.
Yeah, so I want to make sure that I'm understanding.
Yes.
So a couple of points. So does this mean that, because the default is that it just gets reverted at the end of the fiscal year, does that mean that in every BAA there is some set of language that's common to every BAA? Like, for these funds, we're just going to carry whatever is left over forward.
Yes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's good to know.
Yeah.
And then the second thing, something you said was, I felt like I was understanding there was something that, you said that you realized that maybe I'm not understanding.
Okay,
Which is that, because in the list of the funds
yes,
that have to get, that need to have this language that's like,
Yep.
we're gonna carry forward these
Yep.
big funds.
and I can name them if you want.
No, you mentioned like
Yes.
transportation
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
but one of them you mentioned was the general fund, and I guess I had thought that when things got reverted, they got reverted to the general fund.
No,
Okay, where did they get reverted to?
to whatever fund.
Wherever they
it's in.
Where did the
were.
fund they came from?
Yeah, so that's one of the, on the terminology that revert means drop back to the balance of whatever fund it's in.
Okay, as opposed to,
And now, if it moved from a
Okay.
fund to a fund, it's called a transfer.
A transfer, okay.
In our law and practice.
So-
Now, you are correct that if a fund, like if a fund is created for a specific purpose,
yeah,
a special fund, and then that program disappears, sometimes we'll find that there's this fund with a balance, you know,
mhm.
and there's $1,000 in it, that will be transferred to the general fund.
Okay.
So the default is if there's a fund that now is obsolete,
Right.
there should be a transfer to the general fund.
Okay.
We've had a couple of those, I think, in the VA.
On a lot of the smaller funds that are out there, every once in a while we'll sweep them.
Okay, that makes
But-
sense.
But we still, we don't perform that action
Mhm,
at our discretion in finance and management. We present language
mhm.
and, we're not able to effect the transfers. At least we don't. We
Okay.
don't do transfers, just like we don't
Right.
do appropriations. And that scenario you're talking about would be considered a transfer, and it would be in a bill in language. There is law that states anything in that scenario, it should go to the general fund,
Mhm, mhm.
but I don't believe it happens automatically.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Senator Norris?
Yes, for my benefit here. So reversions, I understand, they go back to where they were. What makes it a carry forward? It had to been in a line item at some point. What makes it a carry forward versus a reversion?
In executive branch, it's, Department of Finance and Management's review based on the department's proposal. So they have to, first the department has to say, okay, we have $50,000 left. We want to use it for X, Y, and Z. We review their plan and then say, yes, we'll recommend the secretary approve that, or no, we won't. And then it's ultimately the decision of the secretary that decides whether they will get to spend that money. So that in the language that says, subject to the approval of the Secretary of Administration, appropriations remaining unexpended on June 30th, 2024 in the executive branch shall be carried forward and shall be designated for expenditure. So there is, the way we operationalize it, we automatically actually, like we don't let any reversions take place on June 30th. We automatically carry everything forward, and then we spend time receiving requests, but we turn the spending authority off. No one can spend the remaining balances on July 1. It's not until about September that we complete the review process and approval of the secretary, and then they turn, and then if it's carried forward based on the approval of the secretary, we provide written notice and say, of this appropriation, of that $50,000, $40,000 is approved for carry forward and use based on the uses you proposed, and then 10,000 of that we put in the VAA in the list of reversions.
So there's ongoing checks and balances with both of these funds.
I would describe that as a check and balance is, it's, the review is subject to the secretary's approval. And the Department of Finance and Management, we have, a team of 5 analysts, each one is assigned to various departments and agencies. And they collect all the information, provide presentations to the commissioner and I, and we understand the situation, and we come to a department, a point of recommendation to the secretary. Secretary usually takes our recommendation, but it's not, per law, for this annual session law, until it receives the secretary's signature, we don't actually implement anything.
Thank you.
Yes.
Senator Weston.
So I asked that this, and it may be my convoluted thinking. Usually when it's a reversion, it falls to the bottom line of the overall fund.
Yes, absolutely.
If it's carry forward, my experience has been more than that it's carry forward within a line item for a purpose to
That's
the
right.
next year
That's
in
right.
that, and it doesn't go to the general bottom line.
That's right.
For uses. So the function and the directness of what because sometimes it takes longer than a year to accomplish
That's right.
a specific thing.
With one-time appropriations, that's very often the case. And so you've exactly described the process and the reason to extend that line item appropriation into a second year. I'll offer a distinction though.
You might, it doesn't have to be a one-time. You do a 5 or 10 year IT project
Mhm.
within an area, and stuff doesn't get completed. You don't take it as a reversion. You do just the carry forward to make sure that you can keep working on that project.
That's absolutely correct, but I'd add one twist, which is if it's a base appropriation. So if it's part of a department's base appropriation, and let's say they just had a lot of staff vacancies, so they have a bunch of money left at the end of the year, we are not inclined to let them carry that forward to the next year unless they have specific one-time related uses for that. We do not want to let them carry it forward to offset like retirement benefits cost pressure. The reason is it's a way that departments could artificially deflate their next year's budget, and then that would be a bad budget practice. If they're using carry forward against base expenditures, that's a bad budget practice that we really want to avoid falling in that trap. But a very common use of carry forward is, as you described, oftentimes IT projects not only take longer, but cost more than originally planned. And so in that specific situation, we often approve, if it's out of a base appropriation, we'll approve carry forward to apply towards IT project overruns, for instance. Yep. And the other thing we really encourage is departments to apply towards their anticipated pay act need in the coming up in the current fiscal year. About $1.5 million we found, in this out of the general fund in our last carry forward review process to offset pay act need. And sometimes we help make the departments make that decision. If they don't offer this as a use, we'll say, well, actually new furniture we're not going to approve that use, but we see, because we run numbers, we project your pay act need to be X, so we'll dedicate some of this. And actually we do something a little different with the pay act need. We actually instituted sort of a new process where we actually keep that spending authority turned off until the springtime when the pay act request process actually takes place. And so we make sure it doesn't get spent if we were counting on that to be applied towards pay act. So,
so are people feel okay about what reversion is? Okay. But I don't know if Ellie, you could put up the reversion part of the bill. I don't know if you have the bill, the language from the BAA.
It looks like Amy might be able to send it to me. That's what, yep.
Because it'd be helpful to see. So there's like 40 some reversions. We don't need to talk about the $39 reversions here or there, but the goal here is like if there's any reversions on here that people have a question of, Hardy might be able to answer, or Deputy Commissioner, if there's anything that you see, that you're like, oh, you know, we want to bring your attention to the $8 million that Agency of Administration is reverting. That looks like that's the 27th.
Yeah, I bring you, so really I bring your attention to, a couple items. And, the first one being, by far the largest, base section appropriation. There is an $8 million reversion from the Vermont Department of Labor.
Right.
And that is an unusual, that's a highly unusual situation, especially when you consider that their base general fund appropriation is around $10–11 million. So what's going on there that there would be $8 million left? This is actually the result of a couple years of primarily federal funds impact and COVID federal funds specifically. One of the large factors there was a few years ago when unemployment was like this, and we were hiring contractors for call centers, and there were incredible increases in the cost of that program. In budget adjustment, DOL received about $13 million in a one-time appropriation of ARPA funds to apply to the UI administration. And so that is, over a couple of years, that contributed a lot to them spending less on general fund for UI admin and using up the ARPA dollars, and that built up a lot of that there. It looks like, you know, in retrospect, that that large ARPA appropriation for UI admin really was projecting the current state of unemployment like this to continue. And that's not the way it went. However, you know, it's beneficial at this point to the state that all the general fund spend was offset, because now we have the general fund that can be reverted and redeployed. It's almost a way of repurposing, you know, it was an ARPA eligible use. So using the ARPA funds there has resulted in general fund savings. However, we are recommending it for reversion and redeployment now. One of the reasons it got to be such a big number of 8 million is that last year at the carry forward review process, we were unable to get accurate information from VDOL about what their remaining balances were until well into the fall. And so it was not able to inform the carry forward approval and reversion and BAA development process due to that time frame. And that time frame, not to get too far into the weeds, but they are on their own financial system.
Right.
That is like a mainframe based system written in COBOL.
Right.
And
Written in what?
COBOL.
Oh,
If
that's
you
even
remember,
before my time.
if you remember what that is, yeah. So it's pretty old to say the least. And there have been challenges with getting at times getting accurate information out of their system and reconciling it. In fact, it often, you know, our annual comprehensive financial report is due by Jan 1 for the preceding fiscal year, and we might be down to the wire even getting the dust to settle from the previous fiscal year based with VDOL based on that system. However, this year, miraculously, we were able to find out how much money they had definitively, you know, through their system. So we were able to inform this reversion of $8 million. So I wanted to explain there's a couple factors behind that. The underlying generation of the surplus general fund is the availability of federal funds and then it built up over a couple of years because we didn't have the information sooner. Okay. So that one I wanted to.
Yeah, they were in here and they explained it, but it's good to hear again.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry if I
no,
cut me off if I'm wasting your
It's good
time
to hear that one because I had forgotten.
Okay.
Even though they were here explaining it.
And
But I have a question, one specific that I wondered about, because I
Yeah.
thought I saw an appropriation for the health equity community grants.
Oh, yes, yes.
So it's a
Yep.
reversion, but isn't there also an appropriation
right.
for the same amount?
That's right, absolutely, because the law that established the Office of Health Equity, and as I recall, I think it was like a big bill conference committee, like 11th hour edition, that created the Office of Health Equity. Because there was no home,
Yeah.
dedicated in terms of where to establish the office and where to send the money, it was decided, in conference committee to send it to the Secretary of Administration. But then there were strings tied, like until the Health Equity Advisory Commission, delivered a report on where it should live and various things. You couldn't hire the staff or spend the money, and so based on all the time and things involved in that, at the end of the fiscal year, the money is unspent at the Office of Health Equity. I mean, at the Secretary's office. Right. It hasn't really, and VDH has been determined, Department of Health, as the home for the office, so it's been set up. But there was a one-time appropriation for grants, for the commission to grant out, but that's still sitting stuck at the Agency of Administration. And even if it's for a good purpose that the legislature would agree with, we can't move money from one appropriation to another. So that is why we're recommending the money left at the end of fiscal 24 to be reverted, and then we're reestablishing the appropriation at VDH. So it's net neutral.
Okay. So you could have also
down.
just transferred it.
What's that?
You could have transferred it.
Actually, we can't transfer appropriations above $50,000.
Well, I mean, you could have asked us in the BAA to transfer it. Like, you could have put it in as a transfer, but you put it as a reversion appropriation. Maybe that's a cleaner way of doing it.
It's, with an appropriation, my understanding is that,
You can't
that's how we transfer an appropriation. The word transfer, when we use in our Vermont law, and accounting practices, we use that to mean from one fund to another.
Okay.
But if it's from one appropriation to another, it's different. And since this is an amount remaining at the end of the year, we just said, okay, that's technically a reversion. But we can't transfer appropriations, the emergency board can.
Right.
At an emergency board meeting, they can say, okay, we're gonna drop this by so much and increase this other appropriation because emergency. Right. But that's,
which we'll hear when the treasurer's office talks about how the board took some money and paid it back.
We did. Unfortunately, it's not being deployed for its original purpose.
We'll hear about it.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any other questions, or are there any ones you wanted to bring to our attention?
Yeah, there's one other, so there's one that's in the BAA language. It's an appropriation to Agency of Administration for granting to the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. And it's in the BAA language as an 8.431. It's actually not in the BAA language as a reversion. We approved carry forward of the entire amount of 8.431 million. What happened subsequently is, since delivering the BAA, are two actions. One was, we learned that the amount of being granted, the grant agreement, the amount was actually lowered. And at the same time, so it did not all need to be deployed for this purpose to VHFA. In fact, they weren't gonna receive it because there was a new grant agreement done. And then we also made a discovery, as we sometimes do, of something that we should have put in the BAA that we didn't. And what that was there was a July 1 payment made out of the state's self-insurance liability fund. So this is the fund that we settle liability claims with. This was a payment related to the EB5 settlement made by the Attorney General's office. There had been last year a $9.5 million payment, and we reflected that in the BAA with a transfer. from the general fund to the internal service fund that we use for paying liability claims. And we found that it had not been incorporated in our budget construct, that there had been a $3 million payment made out of the fund as of July 1. And we really felt that we needed to ensure that there was an offsetting general fund transfer into that fund. And the reason for that is a very good one, which is the way we fund the self-insurance liability fund is by assessing all agencies and departments an internal service fund charge. And that includes assessments to federally funded departments, so they all pay in. But we could have a problem in terms of federal regulation compliance when we are settling this EB5 settlement, and then creating a deficit in the fund that would then cause us to increase the rates to recoup that amount in the following year. But then, according to the formula of those assessments, we would be assessing that to federal funds as well as state funds. So that's the reason
What
we
was
made
the
this.
section number on that?
That's actually in the Big Bill C section. And I don't have the citation on the top of my head. I could probably look it up. So since we didn't make it into the BAA,
Oh, so
it's in the C section of the Big Bill, and it's one of those things that I would presume I'm not sure if I think Appropriations may have picked it up and moved it into the BAA. But I just wanted to speak to that item as being.
House Appropriations.
Yes, because I think they, obviously the House hasn't voted. I think the Appropriations Committee just voted it out, yeah.
How much was it? $1?
3 million even.
Yeah.
That was the settlement. So then we adjusted, we made a $3 million reversion from this VHFA grant program that didn't need all the funds in that appropriation, and that's how we funded, that's how we're funding that transfer into the liability fund to cover the EB5 settlement. So those are so that's a change. And in terms of anything, I don't think there's anything else that I feel a need to call the committee's attention to. I will just speak in some, in high level numbers to give you an idea of the amounts we're talking about of appropriations being carried forward. In addition to the 1.428 million that I mentioned we were having carried forward to apply to Pay Act need, $514 million in the general fund is being carried forward to continue to be spent, over $500 million. So it certainly underlines that yes, one-time appropriations typically do not get spent in 1 year, and they need to continue. Of that, only $58 million of that 514 million is out of base appropriations. So one-time appropriations are typically carried forward to continue expenditure on their intended purpose. Conversely, out of the reversions, the majority of the 18.9 million recommended for reversion, the majority at over $13 million is coming from base appropriations. Only $5.6 million of one-time appropriations is being reverted. One-time appropriations are typically carried forward and continue to be spent for whatever the legislature's intended purpose was. And so the few that you find in here that are one-time appropriations being reverted, for instance, it's like a program has come to an end, but there's still some spending authority. House Appropriations emailed me yesterday about, why is this everybody eats appropriation of $144,000 being reverted? So, I responded, well, the program ended in March 2023. So, this funding that was still available in, the program was done. So
We're not killing the program, we just.
the program ended and it's still sitting there, so it's being reverted, but it's a relatively small amount, is typically, being reverted from one-time appropriations, and that's reflected, this year as it typically is.
Okay. Well, we have Ashley waiting for us. Is there any other diversion questions for the deputy commissioner? Well, we know where to find you if we do have any other questions.
Don't hesitate to call.
Okay, great.
Come as fast as I can, but.
Thanks for coming over.
Okay, sure thing, thank you.
Okay, we asked several questions in the treasurer's office. So Ashlyn is here to run us through those items. Do you want us to put the presentation up on the screen?
I think that I can do that for you.
Okay.
Sure.
Sorry to keep you waiting.
That's okay. I canceled on you all last week, so I guess it's only fair.
Yeah, but you had to be still.
Yes, I did. All right, let me just join your Zoom. So while that's loading, for the record, my name is Ashlyn Doyon and I'm the Director of Policy in the Treasurer's Office. I know that there are a number of questions that you have for me, and I sort of went back through my emails with Elle to try to make sure that my slides cover all of the topics, but I recognize that it's likely that they don't. So please feel free to throw at me any other questions or topics that you want to hear from me on. Sort of, I'm all yours, and if I don't have the answers right away, I'll go back and get them for you. So. And also, if this is not the order that you want to do things, I can change that around as well. This should be my slide deck, and it's not. So.
It's nighttime. So.
Yeah. So maybe we'll just do it like this. So I was going to do, I think, when I was maybe scheduled to be in committee earlier in the session, I was going to do a brief overview of the Treasurer's Office. I'm not sure if that's helpful anymore, or if I should just sort of jump right into the topics.
Do people want to hear this up there in terms of this?
I'm sure we can just look at the slides.
Yeah.
Sure, definitely. I did include sort of our organizational chart for the office in the slide deck, and that helps you to see sort of the three main departments, and I think is self-explanatory in terms of what our job responsibilities are. This is the list of committee requested topics that I think you'd like for me to cover. I'm going to start with sort of an abbreviated version of the presentation that we've been doing in the institutions committees on bond ratings and capital debt affordability. I know that there were also some questions on unclaimed property, the higher education trust fund, and some BAA items. So I'll go in that order, but let me know if you want me to jump around.
Unclaimed property.
You don't care if you have?
I know.
Are you
I
gonna do
only
a public?
care if I have something. It's over a certain amount.
You should bring up your website and see if Weston has any.
I could do that if you want. I think I was going to talk about unclaimed property. It's National Unclaimed Property Month, and we also we're going to be having a budget request for 2 new unclaimed property positions. So that was sort of going to be a bit of foreshadowing, but we can skip that if you don't want to hear about it.
I mean, the main thing that I can't remember those sections that we asked if those are the sections, given the action from the House, and also just the question of that $14 million.
Sure.
Is that part of those?
It was not in the sections that Amy identified, but I can do that first.
Okay, let's start there, because I think that's the biggest.
Sure. So I believe it was the spring of 2022, the legislature had some one-time funds. We were searching for sort of high and best use for funds at the time in order to sort of shore up the state's financial portfolio. One of the options that Treasurer Pierce at the time recommended was setting aside $20 million in one-time funds to buy down outstanding state general obligation bonds. So $20 million was appropriated to the Treasurer's Office for that purpose. There were a couple of years where we didn't go out to bond, and that's sort of a larger conversation just about the amount of authorized but unissued debt we currently have on our books, which is basically just where the legislature has authorized projects and debt in the capital bill, but the projects aren't necessarily shovel ready yet, and so we haven't gone out to actually sell the bonds, because you want to make sure that you time those things at a certain point to avoid an arbitrage issue. So we didn't have an impetus to go out to bond for a couple of years. When it was time to go out to bond again under Treasurer Pichek's leadership, we did an analysis to show what the interest rate savings would be if we used that $20 million to buy down bonds in that interest rate environment. And because we had issued previous bonds at lower interest rates than what we're able to get right now, the analysis showed that the savings was approximately $47,000 per $1 million issued over the life of the bond. And we were actually earning almost $50,000 per $1 million just holding that $20 million in cash because of the interest rate environment, and our cash was earning a healthy amount of interest. So we elected not to buy down bonds at that time. And since then, we've just sort of been holding the money, contemplating whether or not that is still the highest and best use of those funds in order to bolster the state's sort of bond ratings and financial health. In the emergency board meeting in August, the administration borrowed $14 million of that $20 million for flood recovery efforts, and the e-board directive sort of mandated that the Commissioner of Finance present a plan to pay back that money in this year's BAA. So that's why in the BAA, you saw that money coming back to the Treasurer's Office. Now, in the meantime, the Treasurer's Office has brainstormed a couple of different uses for that money that we think serve to leverage significant amount of savings on behalf of Vermonters, greater than sort of the analysis with paying down the bonds. One of those proposals is the Treasurer's Medical Debt Relief Initiative, for which we're seeking $1 million to buy down $100 million in medical debt for Vermonters.
So did you get paid back the whole 20 million or just the 14 million?
They only borrowed 14.
Okay.
So we still have
you
6.
still have the 6. Okay.
And then there are a couple of climate infrastructure initiatives that we are hoping to achieve with the remainder of the money. I will say that it's been a difficult couple of weeks with the executive orders coming down and trying to discern what federal match is going to look like for climate infrastructure projects in the future, what the status of FEMA is going to be in the future. And so while I would love to talk about those today and was hoping to when I first came to your committee, I don't think that I'm totally ready to talk about those proposals yet.
And the medical debt, will that be a separate bill, or are you proposing to put that in the big bill?
The medical debt is its own bill, and Senator Lyons is the lead sponsor, and I think the bill will start in her committee.
Right.
And she
It's in our committee right now.
She tried.
What?
You didn't get him to sign on to that bill?
He refused.
Now, last
No.
week,
The reason, he gave a very legitimate reason, very ethical reason for not signing.
don't suck up.
now last week when I was out with the flu, I understand that Treasurer Pichek was approached by the Appropriations Committee in the House, where there was a need for the $14 million for some housing related initiatives. And I understand he testified last week that the treasurer's office would be okay with them using the 14 million for that purpose and not giving it back to us. I kind of joke that I get sick for a week.
He gives away 14
He
million.
gives away 14 million. But so I think we are okay with the construct that's going to be coming over to you from the House, and we hope to still retain the 6 and use at least one of it for medical debt.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
Sure. Okay.
So that leaves 5?
Yeah.
And the 5, you will continue to assess the bond?
I think that I don't foresee the bond market changing soon. Knock on wood, there aren't any like huge changes to the financial markets. We have some climate infrastructure ideas. For 2 years in a row, the legislature has tasked us with surveying climate infrastructure financing and funding opportunities statewide, and whether or not we have been, as a state, leveraging the maximum amount of federal resources for those types of projects. And so we did a huge survey 2 years ago of entities in this space. This past year, we've done 2 large climate finance roundtables, as well as a lot of work with key stakeholders to sort of figure out what some of these opportunities are. We, in November, we submitted a report on this where we identified a couple of proposals. One was sort of a plus-up of the administration municipal technical assistance program, where we think that there's almost $2 million of projects that were identified in that program, but that there wasn't funding enough to cover. And then there's also something called Safeguarding Tomorrow Revolving Loan Fund Program, which is a revolving loan fund program that FEMA will capitalize state money at a 10-to-1 match to establish a revolving loan fund program in Vermont emergency management for these projects. And so we have a recommendation in that report to use the remainder of the $6 million for those 2 things.
I'm guessing, I guess what I'm asking is, the money was originally appropriated for one purpose. And then I understand you were assessing whether that made sense.
Yeah.
Seems like the decision has been made that it doesn't, but it sounds almost like the treasurer's office is thinking like a mini appropriations committee, like what can we do with this money? And ordinarily that money would come back to us, and then the treasurer might recommend to us, once the money was in our hands, what to do with it. So I guess I don't understand the hanging on to the money, working toward a solution with it, and then just getting our okay. That seems like it kind of end runs the appropriations committee, if that makes sense.
So to be clear, we do not have authority to spend it on anything other than bonding.
Understood.
And I think that the goal that we had in having this thought process and these conversations internally was to find, the initial purpose was to use the funds in such a way that would leverage the maximum amount of financial savings for the state.
Right.
And so in our brainstorming, I think we were thinking, okay, if it seems apparent that buying down general obligation bonds doesn't really do that anymore, if we're going to send this money back to the legislature, can we offer a recommendation as to what to do with the money that would achieve a similar purpose in terms of the kinds of savings we were hoping to leverage?
Right. I guess I'm just not understanding why the money isn't being reverted and then we get the recommendations. It seems like, in other words, it might be 5 years you're holding on to that, exploring different options, but we have lots of pressing needs, and if it's not going to what it, in other words, in most departments it would be reverted back to the general fund, but it seems like here it's just sort of, we've got it and we're not gonna let it go until we're ready to say how it gets spent.
Well, I think the nature of the original appropriation plays into that, because the timing of bonding is at the discretion of the treasurer and doesn't always follow the same fiscal year budgetary schedule, right? We time markets and issuance based on project timelines. I think that it's not the same type of line item as other aspects of our budget. But your point is well taken, and I think that, well, I don't think that it would be the treasurer's office's recommendation to revert that money. It would be under the powers of your committee to do that.
And that's why I started by asking, are you still assessing? Because if you're still looking at the original purpose, I'm fine with it staying there, but it seems like a decision has been taken not to use it for that. And now you're exploring in great depth other options for the money.
Yeah.
And I think any department or agency would prefer not to revert money and just have it and develop uses for it and then come get an okay. But I'm just struck when the House Appropriations Committee has to go to the treasurer and say, can we have the 14 million? It should all come back if the decision has been made not to use it for the original purpose. You know what I mean? So giving us 14 million and keeping 6, I find myself asking, under what authority are you keeping the 6?
I think I could have chosen my language and my explanation more carefully.
Okay.
The language in the governor's recommendation for the BAA sent the 14 million back to the treasurer's office.
Yeah.
The House wanted to change the governor's recommendation, and they asked the treasurer last week to come in to comment on that proposed change. So I think they could have changed it without talking to him. I think that they just asked him to come in to get his opinion on the change, and he was favorable to the change.
Yeah, I'll just flag the 6 million or the 5 if one is going to go to the medical debt buy down, just because I still don't understand why it's still sitting with the treasurer if the original purpose is not going to be used, you know.
Right. Well, I think that's a decisions as the treasurer's office is making as they look at the bond. So maybe if this is the year that would happen. You know, this
doesn't sound like the bonds are under consideration, but anyway.
Well, yeah. Like
I mean, right now the bond interest rate, I think when we went out to bond last summer, we got an interest rate of, don't quote me on this, but I think it was 3.5%. A couple of years ago, we were getting 1% bonds. So it didn't really make sense to buy down bonds when we were, you know, when the previously issued bonds, we issued at a lower interest rate. But that was a really, you know, the interest rate environment has changed drastically from when the initial appropriation was made. So I sort of stand by the fact that it's been prudent for us to sort of hang on to that money and not do the initial purpose while we make that
clear,
analysis.
I'm just referring to your testimony.
Yeah.
I started by asking, are you still assessing the bond rates? You said no. We're now on to infrastructure for climate. So if that's the case, that's where my question comes in. But we could obviate the whole discussion by you just saying, we're hanging on to 6 million to continue to assess the bond rates, if that makes sense.
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So that's the 14 million / 20 million.
Yes.
You have others.
I do. At the beginning of the session, Mr. Chair, you had indicated that you wanted to hear about the state bond process and the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee. I think there was a question specifically about what the state's bond ratings were and what would happen if the bond ratings were to be lowered. The state is rated very highly with our bond ratings. We are AA+ across the board with Moody's, S&P, and Fitch. And we actually got similar interest rates when we last went out to bond as our peer AAA states. So as to the question of what would happen if the state's bond ratings were lowered, it is likely that it would increase borrowing costs, that we would have to pay a higher interest rate. I'm not sure the degree to which that would happen. There's a large appetite for Vermont bonds on the muni market because we don't issue very frequently. And I can go into further if it.
Well, my question was, yeah, like, cause you hear that a lot, well, that'll affect our bond rating. And obviously there would be a connection between your bond rating and the interest you get, but I wondered if we had any like dollar amount, like for every drop in our rating, it would cost us X millions of dollars or something like that.
I mean, it really depends on what the interest rate is the day that we go to sell. I will say that the other sort of financial institutions in the state, their bond ratings are benchmarked off of Vermont's bond rating. And so VHFA, VITA, and VSAC and the bond bank, they all have bond ratings that are directly tied to Vermont's bond rating. And so if borrowing costs are increased for the state, then they also are increased for home borrowers, housing borrowers, municipalities, school districts. So it just increased cost overall. And I'll also say that it's really hard to come back from a downgrade in your bond rating. We were downgraded in 2018 from a AAA rated, and we haven't come back since then. So it's been almost 7 years since that initial downgrade. And every time we go to bond, the rating agencies still sort of list a number of areas of improvement that we would need to make in order to see an upgrade. And so it is prudent to do whatever we can to maintain those high bond ratings if possible.
And maybe this is going to be Senator Norris' question. What are those things? Demographics is one of them, right? But what are the other things that they mentioned?
Yeah, demographics is a big one. Continuing to pay down our pension and OPEB liabilities is another. The scale of our debt outstanding, our pension and OPEB liabilities, while we've made significant progress in recent years towards reducing those, and we've achieved close to $6 billion in savings through the Act 114 legislation, those liabilities still really do dwarf our general obligation debt outstanding. That and the demographics, right? So the metrics that the CDAC committee uses to put forward our annual debt authorization, for example, they use debt as a percentage of personal income, debt as a percentage of revenue, debt per capita. And so increasing the population of Vermont and increasing the size of our economy are ways that we can show to the rating agencies that we can support more debt, which translates to higher bond ratings also. So, some of these things we are not going to be able to fix quickly.
Senator Norris, did you have any?
Yes. Probably everybody else here knows this, but could you give me a high level view or give me the definition of what is a bond rating? Is it a loan? What is a bond rating? That's what I'm interested in.
It's akin to your credit score. So individuals are rated by the three major credit rating agencies on a scale of like 400 to 800, and the higher your credit score, the less of a borrowing risk you are. And so, for example, when you go to, yeah, and so the lower the rates, right? So when you see, when you see an advertisement for vehicle financing and it's like 2.9%, but then when you go to the dealer and they pull your credit score and then they offer you 4%, it's maybe because you didn't have the best credit score.
So this is the state of Vermont's credit rating when it comes to, okay.
Yes, and instead of having kind of like an ongoing score like we do every time I pay a bill on time, it translates to my credit score, it goes up a couple of points. The state of Vermont is rated at a point in time basis every time we go out to issue bonds. And we actually pay these three rating agencies each time we go out to issue bonds for that credit rating and report.
Thank you. Senator Brown.
Maybe we should pay them more.
Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way.
I could- I-
And I think that there are some, federal laws. that-
They get paid more when we go down.
Do they?
Everybody makes more interest.
Oh, that's
off
true,
it.
yes.
Yeah.
My question was though, what put us in, cause I was around when we were, so was Richie and a few other people, we were AAA. Was it the pension issue that, or was it a combination of things that brought us down to AA?
It was a combination of things. I think largely the pensions, we had some significant interest rate losses, that were really coming to bear. And you know, that you can see the timing of it, right? We had the bond rating downgrades in 2018 and early 2019. And then, we started working on that pension reform package soon after that in order to address.
Just so we stay away from those, or, you know, try to improve on those issues and make sure we don't fall back into that practice.
Right. And so I included in here just sort of, priorities that the committee can have in mind to maintain the strength of our bond ratings. Pension funding is at the top of that, continuing to pay those ADEX annually, as well as the plus payments that were agreed upon in Act 114. I think the story with the pensions is really good right now, and so as much as we can do to stay on that course, it will pay us back in droves on the credit rating side. The second thing is to work hard to continue to maintain our budget stabilization reserves, also known as your rainy day funds. There are a handful of reserves in state government. The Treasurer's Office did a report in consultation with the Joint Fiscal Office and Finance and Management this year. And we did a survey of budget stabilization reserves and budget stress testing practices across states and made a couple of recommendations in that report for Vermont going forward. And so if you have a minute to look at that, I think that's always helpful. But the short of it is that we're doing a good job, and in times of economic volatility or unpredictability like we're facing now, it's always a good practice to just continue to make sure that we're shoring up those reserves on an annual
So there's
basis.
always a question of stabilization reserves. And at 5% in our stabilization reserve, my sense is that we're a little low compared to some states. And the question always comes, because I think some states are as high as 8, and in a thumbnail, was there any recommendation to go higher than we are, or?
Not at this time. I will say that the level of reserves, that percentage level that you mentioned, some states are as high as 8%, across states nationwide, is usually directly tied to their sources of revenue and the volatility of those revenues. So property taxes, for example, are a very stable source of revenue. There's only so much that your grand list goes up and down every year. Personal income tax and corporate income tax are incredibly volatile sources of revenue, especially corporate income tax. In an economic downturn, that's one of the first that's going to fall. Vermont does rely on those quite a bit, but I think the analysis that we did not recommend any changes at this time. We did recommend some careful thinking about what funds are reserved against. So, for example, the Child Care Financial Assistance Fund, currently, you had set aside, and the report asked us to look at this, the legislature had set aside $8 million extra in the fund and asked the Treasurer's Office to look at whether or not that money should maybe be used as a reserve for the fund. We recommend that is the case. And so just thinking about when we create new programs or we create new funds, whether or not those have adequate reserves, because not all of the special funds that we have in the state are backstopped by a reserve. Theoretically, everything is backstopped by the, the general fund reserve, because you have the power to fill special funds with general fund. But just thinking carefully anytime something new is created about what the backstop would be for that in an economic downturn. And then the final thing is just to continue to adhere to CDAC's biannual debt recommendation, and this year that's $100 million for the biennium. Next I had unclaimed property, but we thought we could maybe skip over that. The one thing I'll mention is that there was a $4.4 million increase to the general fund transfer included in the BAA, which you might see. That's just a normal true up of unclaimed property receipts. We received the majority of those receipts in May, and so there is usually an item in budget adjustment for that purpose. And we are having another record year in unclaimed property. We paid about 19,000 claims last year, and in the first half of this year, we paid over 17,000. And so Treasurer Pichek has really made unclaimed property and returning funds to Vermonters a priority. You'll see in our budget requests that we are requesting 2 new positions for this program that are entirely funded with unclaimed property special fund dollars, and there's no general fund request for that.
But that's for FY26.
Yes, that's for next year's budget. Elle mentioned there were some questions about the Higher Education Trust Fund. So I can speak to that a little bit. In September every year, the Treasurer's Office sends a report to the legislature on the status of the Higher Education Trust Fund, which was established in 1999 to provide non-loan financial aid to Vermont students attending the main post-secondary institutions in the state. There's an annual distribution amount that's dependent upon investment performance out of that fund. This year, there was a significant overall gain in the fund of 10.2%, and
that's just the gain based on the investment, so that includes money being added to it.
Overall gain, so both.
Cool.
And we distributed approximately $1.7 million out of that fund this year.
What is that parenthetical comment? Of that 1.7, this 567 went to those 3 institutions?
Yes.
And what did the rest do?
567 times 3 is 1.7.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I used to be a Senate representative on this, and we met periodically to okay the distribution. And I'm just wondering, I'm trying to think, I don't remember appointing people to it. Did it change how the structure of how that gets okay?
So it changed a couple of years ago. Now it's like the pre-education subdivision of the Higher Education Council or something like that. There are 2.
For the pre-K through 16?
Yes, you know the name better than me probably. There are 2 levels of distribution for this that I didn't articulate on the slide. So the first is a 5% distribution is allowed if there's sufficient investment returns and you can maintain the initial deposited principal balance of the fund. For that one, it's my understanding the treasurer can just do it. There's an additional 2% distribution that can be done.
And it takes a vote by those.
Yes. Now, there was sufficient money in the fund to do that 2% this year. We didn't bring it to the council because in recent years, there's not been enough money to do any distribution. And so the treasurer's call was that it seems to make sense that we have a healthy distribution from the fund this year to hold off on the additional distribution in an effort to have consistency and be able to make future distributions every year.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Generalized?
Okay, so the 567 more went to the Vermont State Colleges and UVM. What percentage go to non-public institutions?
So there's a percentage that goes to VSAC,
Mhm.
and I think that they can use that money to distribute to students attending other post-secondary institutions in Vermont. I'm not sure what exact percentage out of those might have gone, but I'm guessing maybe VSAC could provide that information.
Okay. So, thanks. Interesting.
And there was an original appropriation in 1999, and then there's the investment performance, and then there's this part of statute about the estate tax. Right, like if the estate tax is over a certain amount, it flows into the
I think it's 125
125% of what?
estimate.
You would probably know that better than me. I'm looking, this is the report that we submitted. I'm not sure that we discussed the source of funds in the report. I think that we just talk about the distribution.
And that's an annual report you do, right?
Yes, it's submitted on September 30th.
Yeah, I think the reason I asked about it, because I think at the E-board, when Cavat was reported, he said, oh, we had an increase in the estate tax for one of this trust fund, and I heard about it before, so that's why.
Okay, interesting. I could dig more into that if you were interested.
No, that's fine.
Here I am. Okay, the last thing I think I had on my list was VA section 74, 75, 76, and 77. A lot of these changes were to make state statutes comply with the updated government accounting standards board guidance, and we were okay with them. We had a friendly amendment to section 77, which just changed a few words. We had workshopped this with Nick Kramer and Aaron Broder, and I believe we came to consensus in that it was communicated to the Appropriations Committee last week, to the House Appropriations
Right.
Committee. So I think that it will come to you in this.
With this
form.
change,
Yes.
this shall to may change.
Yes, and then also allowing for underwriters fees.
And
there-
the strikeout as well.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. But you're fine with the other governor recommends, there's other in the other sections.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's what I had in terms of my slide deck, but I can talk to anything else that I might have missed as well.
And I think that's all the things that I had on my list.
Okay.
And now some of these things we'll talk about, one is talk about the FY26 budget, and then about the other, the $6 million or the $5 million of the bond fund. We'll talk about that in the FY26 budget as well.
Definitely, yes.
Okay.
Okay,
Any other questions, Ms. Dillon?
Thank you.
okay, thank you.
And that's all we had for today. Yeah, we were gonna have something else, but it never happened. So there also was a report that on the pensions, I went to a press release, and if you're interested in the pensions and the money and what we've done in the past, there's reports that the treasurer's office pension committees do that I recommend reading. You can see the progress we've made, but also how much way we still have to go. Why we're putting so much money towards it. But unless there's some other public announcement you want to make about unclaimed property that you have, we'll adjourn.
My name doesn't come up when I try.
Oh, yeah?
Okay, well, I'll wait till